On my graduation night, my cousin told everyone I cheated my way through college. As my family raised their glasses to toast his lies, I decided I'd make him regret ever opening his mouth. He was about to learn what it feels like to have everything ripped away. I will tell you how everything unfolded. First, let me thank you for your continuous support. We are on a journey to our first 1,000 subscribers. If you love stories like this one, support us by subscribing to this channel and commenting where you are watching us from. It will be great to hear from you. Now let's jump into the details of what happened. I'd always imagined my graduation party as a small, sunlit room of laughter and music, the kind of night that would grow soft and golden in my memory. My parents' voices, proud, eager, echoed through the warm air of our living room, and for a while, it was easy to believe that everything had fallen into place just as it should. My name is Elliot, and after years of careful steps and quiet sacrifices, I'd finally become the first in my family to earn a degree in environmental engineering. My mother's fingers curled around my shoulder with a tenderness that made my throat ache. My father clapped me on the back every time he passed by, as if the weight of his pride was too heavy to put into words. The night was warm and sweet with promise. The laughter of old friends and distant relatives rose and fell around me like a tide. I stood at the edge of it all, content to be a small, steady presence in the corner of the room. My suit felt stiff around my shoulders, but I'd worn it for them, for the photographs my mother would frame, for the night I wanted to remember. I held a glass of sparkling cider, tracing a circle of condensation onto the dark wood of the coffee table, and let the warmth of the evening settle into my bones. Daniel, my cousin, had always been the one who lit up the room. He was the kind of person who could turn a dull silence into a roar of laughter with a single offhand comment. His grin was an easy thing, a perfect mask that never seemed to slip. He'd been my favorite cousin once, before I learned how hollow his laughter could be. He stood at the center of the room, a smirk playing at the edge of his mouth. I didn't notice at first. My father was talking to me about a job offer in the city, and I was trying to listen, trying to let myself feel the fragile, shimmering excitement of it all. But then Daniel cleared his throat, and the room shifted around him like it always did. Everyone turned to look at him. My parents, my aunts and uncles, the old neighbor who'd known me since I was a child. Every pair of eyes drawn to the boy who could never stand to be outshone. "I have a little announcement," he said, raising his glass. His voice was light and easy, as if he were about to share a story he'd kept in his pocket for just this moment. My stomach twisted in a way I couldn't name. I just thought everyone should know. Elliot didn't really earn that degree. A small, breathless laugh rippled through the room, as if they thought it was a joke. But Daniel's smile didn't falter. He took a slow sip of his drink, and I could feel the cold edge of his words even before they settled fully in the air. "He cheated," he said simply, his voice soft and almost gentle. "All those late nights he spent studying? Turns out they weren't as honest as we all thought." For a moment, the world narrowed to a single point of stillness. My breath caught in my throat. My mother's hand slipped from my shoulder, her fingers hovering as if she couldn't decide whether to reach for me or let me go. My father's expression shifted from pride to something else, something fragile and uncertain. The music in the background seemed to fade into a hush. I could have spoken then, could have told them it was a lie, that Daniel was twisting my name to feed his own need for attention. I could have reminded them of the nights they found me asleep at my desk, the textbook spread open like battered wings. But I didn't. I let the silence stretch between us like a wound that wouldn't close. I let my cousin's words hang in the air, heavy and unchallenged. Because in that moment, standing there with my heart hammering against my ribs, my mother's eyes searching mine, I decided something I hadn't known I was capable of. I decided to let them believe it. I wanted Daniel to feel safe in his victory. I wanted him to think he'd won. The rest of the party blurred around me. The voices that had been warm and bright turned cautious, like footsteps in a darkened room. My father's face was a careful blank. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. I let them look at me and see a disappointment I didn't deserve, and in the quiet space between my ribs, something began to harden. It wasn't rage, at least, not yet. It was something colder. Something that would take root and grow in the days to come. When the last guests left and the house fell into a brittle, uneasy silence, I lay awake in my childhood room. I could still hear Daniel's voice echoing in the back of my mind, the soft finality of his words. I could have reached for anger, but I didn't. Instead, I traced the cracks in the ceiling with my eyes and thought about how carefully I'd learned to hide my quiet strength over the years. I realized that night that I was done playing the part he wanted for me. I was done being the quiet one in the corner, the one who let the lies settle around him like dust. I let him think he'd destroyed me. But in the darkness of that room, with the weight of my degree still fresh in my hands, I promised myself I would make him feel it too, the gut-wrenching betrayal, the slow burn of humiliation. I would let him live in the echo of that night, just as I would. And when it was over, I would be the one who walked away whole. In the days after the party, the house felt smaller somehow, as if the air had grown heavier with all the things we weren't saying. My mother moved through the kitchen like a ghost, her eyes avoiding mine, her hands always busy with something chopping vegetables, wiping down countertops that didn't need cleaning. My father retreated into silence, the weight of his disappointment hanging between us like a second skin. I could have reached for them, could have let the truth pour out of me in a desperate rush. But I didn't. I let them believe it. I let them think their son was a fraud. I went back to my part-time job at the library, shelving books in the hushed rows that smelled of old paper and dust. The quiet there suited me. No one asked questions. No one looked at me with that careful, pitying gaze. In the soft shuffle of pages and the low hum of the air conditioning, I found a kind of peace. I told myself it was temporary, that the truth was something I could retrieve whenever I wanted. But for now, I let it sleep. At home, Daniel's shadow stretched over everything. My parents still invited him for Sunday dinners, their laughter brittle and forced whenever he stepped through the door. I watched him slip into their warmth with practiced ease. He told stories that made them smile, his voice smooth and easy. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded behind his head, the picture of careless charm. And all the while, his eyes would flick to mine, as if to remind me of the lie he'd planted. I didn't fight it. I didn't argue. I let his words take root in their hearts, let him think he'd built something permanent. Because the thing about Daniel was that he never looked past the surface. He never saw how my quiet was a kind of armor, how every polite nod I gave him was a promise I was making to myself. At night, I lay in bed with the light of the moon painting thin silver lines across the ceiling. I thought about the years we'd spent as cousins who might as well have been brothers, the summers in the lake cabin, the long afternoons when he taught me how to ride a bike, how to laugh at the small, stupid things that didn't matter. I thought about how it had all soured so easily, how a single lie could become a fault line running straight through the heart of a family. I kept those memories close, but I didn't let them blind me. The truth was that Daniel had always needed to be the brightest thing in any room, and I'd always been content to stand a little apart, to watch the world move around me. Maybe that was my mistake, believing that there was safety in the shadows. But in that quiet, I began to see the outlines of a plan. Not a grand, sweeping act of vengeance, just the slow, deliberate unveiling of the truth. I knew where to start. Daniel's arrogance had always been his weakness, the way he thought his secrets were locked tight because no one had ever looked close enough to see the cracks. I started small, gathering fragments of conversations I'd half heard over the years, threads of rumors that had always seemed too convenient to be true. I knew where he spent his nights when he wasn't charming my family. Knew the bars where he let his tongue slip after a few drinks, the friends he'd bragged to about deals that skirted the edge of legal. I didn't have the whole story yet, but I knew enough to see the shape of it. And I let him think I was still broken, still the quiet cousin who would never dare to fight back. It was almost easy, slipping back into the role he'd written for me. At dinner, I smiled when he told his stories, even laughed when he made a joke at my expense. He thought my silence meant surrender. He thought he'd won. But at night, when the house was still and the air felt thick with all the things left unsaid, I turned over the pieces of his life like puzzle pieces in my mind. I thought about the way he looked at me that night, smug, certain, and I let that memory feed the small, steady flame of resolve that had taken root in my chest. I didn't hate him. Not yet. Hate was too loud, too heavy. What I felt was quieter than that. A calm, cold clarity that settled into my bones like winter air. I would let him have his victory for now. Let him smile, let him bask in the glow of his own deception. Because when the truth finally came, it would cut through all of it, and I would be the one holding the blade. The first secret I found was almost too easy. It was tucked away in a half-forgotten conversation I'd overheard at a family barbecue years ago. Daniel bragging about a shady business deal, half-drunk and leaning too close to his friend's ear. I'd been 17 then, too young to understand the weight of the words. But I remembered the flicker of guilt that had crossed Daniel's face when he caught me watching. Back then, I'd pushed it aside, too eager to keep the peace, too willing to believe the best of him. But now, in the quiet hours of early morning when the world was still and my thoughts were sharp as winter air, I turned that memory over and over like a puzzle piece. I started with the people who knew him best, his friends, the ones who filled his nights with laughter and cheap beer. I watched them at bars where Daniel liked to hold court, his smile bright, and his stories always just a little too perfect. I learned to blend into the background, to let my silence become a kind of camouflage. In the low light of those crowded rooms, no one noticed the quiet man nursing a single drink in the corner. One night, I caught a conversation that shifted something in me. A friend of Daniel's, someone I recognized from family gatherings, let slip a careless laugh, a drunken confession about the money Daniel had borrowed from a business partner. My breath caught, but I didn't move, didn't let the tremor of triumph show on my face. I let the words settle in my mind, a thread I would follow until I found its end. I started combing through his online life, the digital footprints he'd never thought to hide. Daniel was always so careful in person, but his online self was sloppy, half-drunk photos tagged at bars he claimed he never visited, comments left on shady investment pages, a trail of arrogance and carelessness that had gone unnoticed for too long. Piece by piece, I built a mosaic of his lies. It wasn't enough to ruin him yet, but it was enough to know that he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. At home, I played the part of the dutiful son. My mother's eyes were still clouded with quiet disappointment, and my father barely spoke to me at dinner. But I let that weight settle on my shoulders like an old coat. I wore it, but I didn't let it crush me. I let them believe I was still lost, still the boy they thought had cheated his way through the only thing that had ever mattered to them. It was easier this way. They wouldn't see what I was building, wouldn't feel the quiet, steady pulse of my resolve. Some nights, I would find myself staring at the ceiling long after the house had gone still. I'd remember the summers we spent as children, Daniel teaching me how to skim stones across the lake, his laughter echoing in the warm dusk air. I'd remember the way he'd wrapped an arm around my shoulder, calling me his little brother. Those memories felt like ghost stories now, whispers of something that had died before I even knew it was gone. But I didn't let them soften me. If anything, they made me sharper. Because I realized that this wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about reclaiming the part of myself I'd given away to his easy smiles and practiced lies. The part that had always believed he was better, brighter, more deserving of the world's light. I wasn't that boy anymore. Every new detail I uncovered felt like a quiet promise to myself. A reminder that I wasn't powerless, that I didn't have to live in the shadows of his lies. I didn't know exactly how it would end, what shape my revenge would finally take, but I knew I was closer now. Closer to the moment when I would strip away his mask and leave him as bare and broken as he'd left me that night. And through it all, I kept my silence. I let him keep his laughter and his easy, careless grin. Let him believe that he was safe, because the truth was patient. And I had learned, in the long hours of that quiet darkness, how to be patient too. The final pieces of Daniel's deception came to me like an aftertaste. Bitter, lingering in the back of my throat long after the first swallow. A bank statement slipped carelessly into a pile of papers on his desk when he thought no one was looking. A photograph half buried in his phone's camera roll, showing him at a meeting he swore he'd never attended. Small things, but together they told a story that no lie could disguise. I should have felt triumphant, should have let the quiet certainty of it settle into me like a balm. But in the stillness of those late nights, when I was alone with the weight of my own thoughts, doubt seeped in through the cracks. I'd never been the kind of person who sought out conflict. I'd always chosen silence over shouting, calm over fury. And now here I was, piecing together a plan to burn down everything my cousin had built, everything my family had believed in. I remembered the summers at the lake cabin, how Daniel would drag me out of bed before dawn to watch the sun rise over the water. We'd sit side by side on the rickety wooden dock, our feet dangling in the cold, silver-dark water, and he'd talk about the future in a voice that made it all seem so easy. Back then, he was the one who made me believe that there was room for me in the world, that I could be something more than the quiet boy in the corner. It was that boy I thought of when the doubts crept in, the one who had looked at Daniel and seen someone who would always have his back. I wondered if I was killing that memory with every piece of evidence I gathered, every quiet step I took closer to exposing him. I wondered if I was becoming just like him, someone who would betray the people he loved to protect himself. Some nights, I lay awake and stared at the ceiling, feeling the ghosts of those childhood summers breathing in the darkness around me. The laughter we'd shared, the secrets we'd whispered into the quiet night air, they felt like echoes of a life that had never really belonged to me. I held those memories in my hands, turning them over like stones worn smooth by water, trying to find the shape of who I'd been and who I was becoming. I didn't want to be a mirror of his cruelty. I didn't want to become a man who could only define himself by what he destroyed. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't about vengeance for its own sake. It wasn't about power or pride. It was about taking back the part of me he'd stolen the night he stood up in front of everyone I loved and called me a liar. I knew the truth was a blade that cut both ways. It would wound him, yes, but it would cut into me too, leaving scars I'd have to carry. But I'd rather live with those scars than with the hollow ache of letting his lie become the shape of my life. I'd rather be the one who chose to stand in the light, even if it meant casting a shadow I couldn't outrun. In the end, I let the doubt settle into me like a quiet ache. I didn't try to chase it away. I let it remind me that what I was about to do mattered, that it wasn't just a game or a story I was telling myself. I let it make me careful, deliberate. Because if I was going to tear down Daniel's carefully constructed mask, I needed to be sure I was doing it for the right reasons. And in that soft, uncertain darkness, I found a final resolve. I wouldn't let his lies be the last word in my story. I wouldn't let the weight of his betrayal define who I was. I was still the boy who loved the early morning quiet, who found comfort in the steady hush of the world before it woke. And I was also the man who had learned how to be patient, how to let the truth grow in the dark until it was strong enough to stand on its own. I carried that knowledge with me as I took the final steps toward the night I knew would end it all. My doubt didn't vanish. It didn't need to. It was just another part of me, like the quiet strength I'd always carried in my chest, the small, steady flame of hope that even the sharpest betrayal couldn't snuff out. The night I chose was one of those soft, early summer evenings when the air was warm and heavy with the scent of new leaves. It was a family dinner in the backyard, laughter weaving through the spaces between clinking glasses, the grill sending up thin wisps of smoke. My parents had tried to make it feel like the old days, before everything had cracked apart. But underneath the laughter, I could feel the same brutal tension that had become a quiet undercurrent in our lives since that night. Daniel arrived late, of course. He swept in with that easy grin, his arms spread wide in greeting, the kind of entrance that had always made people lean in closer, wanting more. He was the same as he'd always been, careless charm wrapped in a smile that never quite reached his eyes. And no one saw the lie beneath it, not until I was ready to show them. I waited until dinner was over, until the plates were scraped clean and the soft glow of string lights had turned the yard into a quiet dream of warmth and comfort. My father was telling a story about his own college days, his voice slow and nostalgic. My mother laughed, but there was a tightness around her eyes. I watched Daniel lean back in his chair, so sure of his place in the center of it all. When the conversation lulled, I stood up. My heart beat steady and quiet in my chest. A slow, deliberate rhythm that kept me grounded. My hands didn't shake. I'd spent too many nights holding them steady in the darkness, rehearsing every word until it felt like a prayer. I have something to say, I said, and my voice was calm, almost gentle. The way his had been the night, he turned them all against me. Daniel looked up, his smile flickering just a little at the edges. Elliot, he said, his voice smooth as glass. Now's not the time for, no, I said, cutting him off softly. Now's exactly the time. I took a deep breath and began to tell them. Piece by piece, I laid out the truths I'd gathered like an offering. The money he'd siphoned from a family friend's investment, The photos that placed him at meetings he'd sworn he'd never attended, the web of half-truths he'd spun around his carefully constructed life. I spoke slowly, giving each word the weight it deserved. I didn't look at Daniel as I spoke. I looked at my parents, at the family I'd let him fool for too long. At first, there was only silence. A heavy, breathless hush that felt like the moment just before a storm. My mother's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide and glistening in the low light. My father's face was pale, his jaw working as he tried to find words that wouldn't come. Daniel's smile died by degrees. I watched the panic flicker behind his eyes. Just for a moment. Just enough to know that he understood the truth was something he couldn't outrun. He tried to laugh it off at first, his voice high and brittle. "Come on, Elliot. You're really going to dredge up old rumors? This is family." But I didn't flinch. I didn't let his words muddy the calm I'd built around me like armor. "It's not rumors, Daniel," I said quietly. "It's the truth, and you know it." He tried to stand, to push past me with that easy charm that had always been enough. But I held my ground. I met his eyes and let him see that I wasn't the boy he'd broken that night. I was something else now, something he'd never imagined I could become. One by one, the others began to look at him the way they'd looked at me months ago. The questions started softly, the disbelief in their voices a quiet echo of the hurt I'd carried in my chest for so long. Daniel stammered, his hands lifting in helpless, empty gestures. He tried to twist the narrative, but the truths I'd laid bare left no room for his lies. I didn't watch him fall apart. I thought I would want to see it, that I'd want to savor every flinch and falter. But when it happened, when the room turned on him the way it had once turned on me, I felt only a quiet emptiness. The cold, steady ache of finality. Because this wasn't about punishing him anymore. It was about reclaiming the pieces of myself he'd stolen. It was about standing in the light of the truth and letting it burn away everything that had been false. When it was over, I sat back down. My parents looked at me with eyes that were still wide with shock. But there was something else there too, something that looked like the first fragile glimmer of understanding. Daniel stood frozen, his shoulders hunched, his mouth working soundlessly. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just let the truth settle between us like the final, unspoken word. And in the hush that followed, I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even relieved. I was just free. Free from the weight of his lies, free from the quiet ache of pretending to be someone I wasn't. Free to let the night close around me like the quiet end of a song. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped away from the house, the voices of my family fading into the hush of early summer darkness. The back porch light spilled a pale circle onto the grass, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to see their faces anymore, the confusion, the disbelief, the raw wound of betrayal that had finally turned in the direction it was always meant to face. I let it all fall away behind me, the night closing around my shoulders like a cloak. I walked slowly, each step deliberate and unhurried. The quiet wrapped around me, soft and heavy, and I let it fill the spaces where anger and hurt had once lived. I thought about the way Daniel's face had crumpled, the way his voice had cracked when he realized the safety he'd built for himself was nothing more than a hollow shell. I thought about the way my parents had looked at me, their expressions shattered and searching, and I thought about the boy I used to be, the one who would have done anything to keep the peace, who would have swallowed the lie just to hold on to their smiles. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel whole. I felt empty. Like there was a quiet hollow in my chest where all the noise had once been. It wasn't the sweet victory I'd imagined on those long nights when I lay awake, planning every quiet step of my revenge. It wasn't satisfying, but it was honest. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was breathing clean air. I walked down to the edge of the yard, where the soft glow of the porch light didn't quite reach. The night was alive with small sounds. The rustle of leaves, the quiet hum of distant traffic, and I let it fill my head, each breath a small, careful prayer. I thought about how revenge had become a kind of weight I'd carried, a burden I'd taken on so quietly that no one had noticed. I thought about how it had felt to stand in front of them all and speak the truth without fear, how it had felt to finally let the silence shatter. I didn't know what would happen to Daniel now. I didn't care. His lies were his own to carry, his own to atone for. I'd done what I needed to do, not for them, not even for him, but for me. Because I couldn't live with the weight of his betrayal any longer. I couldn't keep swallowing the lie, pretending it didn't matter. The quiet emptiness I felt was my own, and that made it bearable. I thought about my parents, about the way my mother's eyes had searched mine in the final moments of that night. Her lips parted as if to speak. Maybe one day, they'd see me again. Really see me, not the boy Daniel had painted in his lies. Maybe they wouldn't. Either way, I was done carrying the burden of their disappointment. I was done living in the shadow of his easy charm. I took a slow breath and let it out, feeling the way it settled into my chest like a final exhale. I wasn't healed. I wasn't whole. But I was honest. And that was enough. When I reached the end of the yard, I turned back once, just long enough to see the house in the distance. The warm glow of lights, the hushed silhouettes of the people inside. A place I'd always thought of as home, and now, something else. Not an ending, but a quiet parting. A closing of the door on a chapter I'd carried for too long. I walked away from it all without looking back. My steps were slow, steady, deliberate, and in the small, still space inside me, I found a kind of peace. Not the sweet rush of victory, but the quiet finality of letting go. And in that final, empty hush, I knew I was free. If you felt the weight of Elliot's quiet triumph and the bitter ache of his final release, let me craft a revenge story just for you. Share your idea, and together we'll shape the heartbreak, betrayal, and the quiet peace that comes after. See you soon in our next story.